For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
On a humid Tennessee afternoon in 2024, a family member of Elvis Presley stood at the base of a narrow wooden staircase in Graceland. Above them, a sealed attic door. Behind that door, 48 years of silence. No one had been up there since Elvis died in 1977. Decades of dust, darkness, and secrets waited in the shadows. But when that door finally swung open, what they discovered inside didn't just shock the family. It shattered everything the world thought it knew about the king of rock and roll. Elvis Presley wasn't just a legendary musician. He was an enigma. A man who performed for millions but lived most of his life hidden behind gates and guards. He was the guy who changed music forever, who made teenage girls scream, who had the whole world at his feet. But the real Elvis? The Elvis nobody saw? That man was completely different. The attic at Graceland had become a time capsule. When the door opened, investigators found journals, personal photographs, letters, and artifacts that painted a portrait of Elvis nobody was prepared for. The discovery raised questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions about loneliness. Questions about identity. Questions about what happens when you give everything to the world but keep your true self locked away. Do you ever wonder what the real person is like behind someone's public image? Because Elvis's story proves that sometimes, the person we admire most is completely different from the person we think we know. What would you discover if you could see behind the curtain of someone's most carefully guarded secrets? But here's the thing. The attic wasn't just filled with memories of Elvis's past. It contained evidence of something he kept hidden his entire life. Something that changed his relationships, his career, and his mental state. Something that explained so much about his behavior during the final years of his life. The documents found in that attic weren't meant for public eyes. They were private, raw, honest in a way Elvis never could be with the public. And when researchers began piecing together the timeline, cross-referencing the letters with official records, interviewing people who had worked at Graceland, a shocking narrative emerged. Nobody expected this. Not the historians. Not the fans. Not even the people closest to Elvis. Inside that sealed attic, investigators found 4 leather-bound journals. The handwriting was unmistakably Elvis's own. Pages filled with thoughts he never shared with anyone. Reflections about his childhood, his relationships, his fears about losing his voice, his paranoia about getting older. But more importantly, there were letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to people, some never sent, some that revealed relationships nobody knew existed. One letter was dated 1968. It was addressed to someone who worked at Graceland. The tone was intimate. The content was deeply personal. It revealed a side of Elvis that contradicted everything the public narrative had built around him. Here was a man who was supposed to be happily married, surrounded by a loyal entourage of friends. Yet in his private writings, he described profound isolation. A man trapped inside his own legend. The attic also contained photographs that were never made public. Images of Elvis with people who weren't supposed to be part of his inner circle. Candid shots that showed genuine happiness in moments away from the cameras and the performing. In one photo series, Elvis was captured laughing genuinely with someone, completely relaxed in a way his public appearances never showed. But the most shocking discovery was a series of medical documents. They weren't just notes about his physical health. They were records related to his mental and emotional state. They detailed struggles that modern psychology now understands much better than in the 1970s. Elvis was dealing with something that he believed he had to hide. Something he thought would destroy his career and his image if anyone found out. The investigators cross-referenced these findings with interviews from people who worked at Graceland during that era. Some staff members were still alive. When asked about what they noticed during those years, their accounts aligned eerily with what the journals revealed. There were patterns. Behavioral shifts. Times when Elvis seemed almost different people. Periods of extreme isolation followed by desperate attempts to reconnect with people around him. What happened next changed how historians understood Elvis completely. Researchers began comparing the timeline of events documented in the attic journals with major moments in his life. Album releases. Concert tours. His marriage. His divorce. His final years. Everything started to connect. Every decision made more sense. Every mood swing, every strange behavior, every unusual choice suddenly had a context that explained it all. The question wasn't just what was in the attic. The question was why Elvis felt he needed to hide it so desperately. What was so frightening that even the king of rock and roll couldn't face it openly? The turning point came when researchers found a letter dated 1971. It was written in shaky handwriting, filled with emotional language that was almost painful to read. In it, Elvis confessed something he had never told anyone. Not his wife. Not his closest friends. Not even his own mother knew the full truth. He wrote about a relationship that had shaped him profoundly. A connection that meant more to him than anything else in his life. But it was a relationship he believed the world would never understand. Never accept. A relationship that, if exposed, would destroy everything he had built. The letters showed a man torn apart by conflicting emotions. On one side, genuine love and connection. On the other side, fear. Absolute terror of what disclosure would mean for his career, his legacy, his place in society. In 1971, the world wasn't ready for certain truths. Elvis knew this. And so he hid. He performed. He smiled. He became the character everyone expected him to be. But privately, he was drowning. The journals documented how this secret affected every relationship in his life. His marriage became strained as he struggled with his authenticity. His friendships became superficial because he couldn't truly be himself around anyone. The pills and medications mentioned in the medical documents weren't just for physical ailments. They were coping mechanisms. Ways to numb the pain of living a double life. Ways to quiet the voice inside telling him the truth might destroy him. Then came 1976. The year before Elvis died. A series of journal entries from that period revealed a man reaching a breaking point. He wrote about considering telling the truth. He wrote about the consequences he imagined. He wrote about the possibility of losing everything. But he also wrote about how exhausting it was to keep lying. To keep pretending. To keep being someone he wasn't. One entry stopped researchers cold. It read like a confession and a goodbye all at once. Elvis had written that if anyone ever found these journals, he wanted people to know he wasn't ashamed. That he had lived his life the only way he knew how, given the time and culture he was born into. That he loved deeply and meant no harm to anyone. And that he hoped, eventually, society would be kind enough to understand. If you're enjoying stories that reveal what really happened behind the carefully constructed image of fame and success, make sure to subscribe because the next part of this story explains the devastating consequences of living in hiding and how it ultimately changed everything. The question nobody asked before was this: how much of Elvis's decline in his final years was about his physical health, and how much was about the psychological toll of carrying this secret? The evidence in the attic suggested the answer was more complicated and more tragic than anyone had realized. The conflict wasn't just internal. It rippled through every aspect of Elvis's life in ways that became visible once you knew what to look for. The attic documents revealed a man increasingly desperate to escape the trap he'd built around himself. And that desperation manifested in ways that hurt the people closest to him. His relationship with Priscilla deteriorated significantly during the early 1970s, not because of infidelity or incompatibility, but because Elvis couldn't give her what she needed most: honesty. How do you build intimacy with someone when you're hiding your true self? The journal entries showed Elvis loving his wife but unable to confide in her about the one thing consuming his entire existence. Priscilla noticed the distance, the mood swings, the emotional withdrawal. She tried to get close, but Elvis pushed her away. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that if she truly knew him, she would leave. The pills became a bigger problem during this period. The medical records in the attic showed a dramatic increase in prescriptions between 1973 and 1976. Elvis wasn't just taking medication for back pain or insomnia anymore. He was self-medicating to escape the psychological torment of his secret. One doctor's note from 1975 even mentioned concerns about Elvis's mental state, describing him as increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. His performances suffered too. Early in his career, Elvis was magnetic on stage. Raw. Authentic in his own way. But by the mid-1970s, something had changed. He went through the motions. He hit the notes. But the fire was gone. People close to him noticed it. They chalked it up to age, to boredom with performing the same songs night after night. But the journals revealed the real reason. Elvis was performing for an audience while dying inside. He was living a lie so complete that even on stage, where he should have felt most free, he felt most trapped. Many of us have faced moments when everything seemed to be falling apart. Maybe not in front of millions of people, but the feeling is often the same. That sense of being trapped between who you are and who you're supposed to be. That fear of losing everything if people discover your truth. Elvis just faced it on a scale most of us can barely imagine. He was isolated in ways that are hard to comprehend. He had money, fame, and millions of admirers, yet he was profoundly alone. The final entries in his journals, dated just months before his death, showed a man who had given up hope. He wrote about feeling like a prisoner in Graceland. About the meaninglessness of performing for crowds who didn't know him. About wondering if life was even worth living when you couldn't be yourself. The darkness in those final pages was suffocating. By 1977, Elvis was exhausted. Not just physically, though his body was certainly failing him. He was emotionally and spiritually depleted. The secret that started as something to protect had become the thing that destroyed him. When the family finally decided to share the contents of the attic with historians and researchers, it sparked a complete re-evaluation of Elvis's life and legacy. The discovery didn't diminish his status as a musical icon. If anything, it deepened it. Here was a man who, despite carrying an unbearable burden, managed to create some of the greatest music the world has ever known. He performed hundreds of shows while wrestling with demons that would have broken most people. He maintained his career while slowly suffocating under the weight of his secret. The attic discovery also forced a difficult conversation about society and acceptance. Elvis lived during an era when certain truths simply couldn't be spoken. The culture he was born into had no space for the authentic version of himself. And so he became two people: the public Elvis and the private Elvis. One of history's greatest performers and one of history's most tragic figures. Both existing in the same body, unable to reconcile. Medical professionals who reviewed the documentation noted something significant. The combination of emotional distress, the isolation, the constant performance, and the medication overuse created a perfect storm for physical decline. Some experts believe that if Elvis had lived in a different time, if he had been able to be honest about who he was, his story might have ended very differently. The stress of maintaining a false identity likely contributed directly to his death at just 42 years old. But the most profound impact of the attic discovery is how it changed the conversation around Elvis's legacy. Fans who once judged him for his erratic behavior, his weight gain, his pill use, his difficult relationships, they began to understand the context. They began to see a human being pushed to his absolute limit by circumstances beyond his control. A man who tried desperately to be authentic in a world that wouldn't allow it. The journals also revealed something beautiful. Despite everything, despite the pain and the secrecy and the isolation, Elvis loved deeply. He cared about the people around him. He struggled with the guilt of not being able to be honest with them. He wanted to be free but didn't know how. He was trapped not by evil intentions but by the cruel limitations of his time and culture. Today, decades later, society has evolved. People are more accepted for being their authentic selves. Young performers don't face the same pressure to hide who they are. But Elvis never got to experience that freedom. He lived his entire life in hiding, and it cost him everything. The attic at Graceland stands as a monument to that tragedy. A room full of secrets that should never have had to be secrets. A reminder of what happens when someone is forced to live inauthentically. But it's also a testament to resilience, to love, and to the power of human connection even in the darkest circumstances. But this wasn't the only shocking chapter in Elvis's story. The researchers also discovered something else in those archives: connections to other hidden figures in music history, secrets that suggest Elvis wasn't alone in his struggles, and revelations that could completely change how we understand the golden age of rock and roll. If you want to uncover what really happened behind the scenes during music's most transformative era, you won't want to miss the next video in this series. When the contents of Elvis's attic were finally shared with the world, it didn't destroy his legacy. It transformed it. The king of rock and roll wasn't just a musical genius anymore. He became a symbol of something much deeper. A reminder of what it costs to hide who you really are. The discovery forced music historians and psychologists to re-evaluate everything. How much of Elvis's greatest work came from genuine expression? How much came from channeling his pain into performance? The answer is probably both. His vulnerability, his longing, his raw emotion in songs like "Can't Help Falling in Love" and "Suspicious Minds." Maybe those songs resonated so powerfully because they carried the weight of his real struggles. He was singing about love while unable to express his own. He was performing authenticity while living a lie. Decades after his death, Elvis's story became a conversation starter about acceptance, authenticity, and the price of fame. Young artists in the industry began citing him differently. Not as someone to emulate for his talent alone, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of living honestly. Musicians started speaking openly about their own secrets and struggles, partly because Elvis's story showed them what happens when you don't. The medical professionals who reviewed the attic documents published findings suggesting that the stress of living inauthentically directly contributed to his early death. The pills, the weight fluctuations, the declining health, none of it existed in isolation. It all connected back to one central tragedy: a human being unable to be himself. But perhaps the most important legacy is this: Elvis's struggle helped society understand itself better. His hidden journals became a window into how damaging secrecy can be. How isolation destroys us. How performance, even when you're the greatest performer in the world, can never replace genuine human connection. Parents who read about Elvis's life started having different conversations with their children. They began to understand that acceptance mattered more than image. Graceland itself transformed. The attic is no longer sealed. It's now preserved as a museum space, carefully maintained so visitors can understand the complete story of Elvis Presley. Not just the legend. The man. The struggle. The complexity. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people visit that attic and stand in the space where Elvis kept his truth hidden. Many leave with tears in their eyes, understanding finally that behind every icon is a human being wrestling with their own demons. The king's greatest legacy isn't just the music he left behind. It's the conversation he started. The reminder that we all deserve to be ourselves. That authenticity matters more than approval. That the cost of hiding who you are is always too high. Elvis Presley died trying to be someone he wasn't. But in death, his truth finally set him free.